the guy who wears this all the time would leave it in good condition, I wouldn't have any problems getting ready every week. 2 Kings chapter 11, as it says on the board, is where we are. 2 Kings chapter 11, looking at Joash. Go ahead, and you might want to mark 2 Chronicles 24, because we will be turning there as well as we progress more into chapter 12. But especially when we get into chapter 12, we'll be looking to the Chronicles account because it's a little bit fuller. Of course, Kings and Chronicles were written for different purposes. And you remember the Kings cover everything from Kings north and south. The Chronicles only focus on the kings of the south. And more than that, they focus on the spiritual elements of it. And so it's kind of interesting when you think about how the writer of the Kings speaks of Joash and how the writer of the Chronicles speaks of Joash. You learn some things about their purposes. In the eyes of the writer of the Kings, Joash is, pretty decent king. When the eyes of the writer of the Chronicles, he's a little bit less so. And there's some focus on his spiritual issues. And, of course, that's what the Chronicles writer was driving at. He was explaining to the captives why they had gone into captivity, and it was their spiritual decisions. And so he would focus a lot on the temple and the priesthood and a lot of those particular things in the process. So now here's where we are in chapter 11 with Joash. Remember where time is kind of lapping over a little bit, because this has picked up where Jehu kills the king of the north and also the king of the south. And then we saw Jehu at the end of chapter 10 and the end of his reign. And now this kind of backs up in time a little bit. So you've got Jehu's reign, and then we kind of back up a little bit, and here is Joash. Okay, and then we'll be propelled forward in this particular reign as well. And so now we're looking at Judah a little bit more. You remember that we spent the majority of our time, or the writer of Kings does, focusing in on the house of Ahab because of his idolatry and the introduction of Baal worship. And it has been eradicated in the north, as have all of the members of Ahab's family. The lone remaining member of Ahab's family is Athaliah, and she's going to be disposed of here, as well as Baal worship in the south. And then Ahab and his descendants will be basically no more. All right, so we're picking up in verse 4 technically, but I want to back up to 1, and let's just read it, the flow. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family. As we said, motherly intuition apparently just did not take with her. She finds out her son is dead, so she decides to slaughter all of her other sons and her grandsons. And I don't care if people say that's customary for that culture. It still displays something that was wrong. Okay? It's with the Bible, which was also written in that same culture, also says that there are people without natural affection. And she is displaying something without natural affection. Okay? If you don't have a natural affection, a natural love, if you kill your grandchildren. And so she's going into this particular sinfulness. So she destroyed all the royal family, but Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death, and she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Thus they hid him from Athaliah so that he was not put to death. And he remained with her 6 years, hidden in the house of the Lord, while Athaliah reigned over the land. Okay, and again, last week we said, where will you hide them? Sometimes hiding is best done in plain sight, and also in a place where they're never going to be. Athaliah has zero regard for the God of Israel. She is completely and totally given to Baal worship, and so she's never going to step foot in the temple area. Okay? So it's the perfect place to hide him. He's not looking. Remember we talked about last week the old adage that some people talk about that, if you were going to hide something valuable from certain people, you'd hide it in their Bible because they don't crack it. Right? And so hiding it in certain places. The perfect place to hide is actually right underneath her nose. The same way that it's interesting, Herod kind of loses his mind in Matthew chapter 2 because he hears this king has been born, and what he doesn't understand is that if you're if you're sitting in Bethlehem where Jesus is born, the shadow of his palace kind of casts over the very place Jesus is born. He was right under his nose the whole time, and he just didn't know it. And so hiding in plain sight sometimes. All right, verse 4. But in the seventh year of Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the Karaites and of the guards and had them come into the house of the Lord. Now the Karaites are a royal bodyguard. Exactly their origin and every other thing along those lines, it's a little bit difficult to ascertain. And that has to do sometimes with the words that are used in different locations. But they are bodyguards of royalty in certain, maybe hired mercenaries along those lines. And so he made them come into the house of the Lord, and he made a covenant with them and put them under oath in the house of the Lord, and he showed them the king's son. And he commanded them, this is the thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you, those who come off duty on the Sabbath and guard the king's house, this is a parenthetical statement, another third being by the gate Sur, and the third being at the gate behind the guards, shall guard the palace. And the 2 divisions of you, which come on duty in force on the Sabbath, guard the house of the Lord on behalf of the king, shall surround the king, each one with his weapons in his hand, and whoever approaches the ranks is to be put to death. But with the king be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. And so what he's basically planning is, a coup is not really the right word because he is the rightful heir. Athaliah is the one who has perpetrated the coup, right? And so it's really, he's trying to set things back in the right order. But he realizes this has to be done in a quick and an accurate way. And so he's talking to these 3 bodyguards, and at the normal changing of the guard, instead of the bodyguards that are on duty releasing and walking away, they simply join the 3rd band of bodyguards, and then they spread out, they peel out, and 2 surround the king, and others surround the temple area and things along those lines and protect him. Okay, so that's what he's doing. He's orchestrating, making sure that Joash remains protected. And basically says if anyone approaches who isn't authorized, then kill them. Verse 9, then the captains did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and they brought each of his men who were to go off of duty on the Sabbath, and there were those who came on duty on the Sabbath and came to Jehoiada the priest, and the priest gave the captains spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in the house of the Lord. Okay, now, what we need to understand here is that this is not him giving them shields and spears because they didn't have shields and spears. Okay? If they're bodyguards, they have those things. The emphasis here is that they had been King David's. This is more symbolic in its nature because Athaliah is not a direct descendant of David. And Athaliah has usurped the throne. And so with Joash coming back to the throne, it's a symbol of David's line returning to control. And so it's more than just giving them shields and a spear. It's actually highly symbolic of what is transpiring, that David's family is now going to the rightful place of the throne where it should have been, even though Athaliah usurped it for 6 years. Verse 11, and the guards stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the south side of the house to the north side of the house, around the altar and the house on behalf of the king. Then he brought out the king's son and put a crown on him and gave him the testimony. And they proclaimed him king and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, long live the king. And we've kind of seen this coronation type ceremony in the first part, 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2 with Solomon. But what's interesting is he places the crown upon him, which there's nothing shocking about that, right? He's going to be the one who takes over. But then it says, and he gave him the testimony. He gave him the testimony, which is a word in the Old Testament to describe Scripture. Okay? Look for just a second at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Now, previously, you remember, a king was something that God did not want for them. He gave it to them, 1 Samuel chapter 8. The prophet Hosea said, or God said through Hosea, I gave them a king in my anger, and I took him away in my wrath. But God knew that was going to happen, and so he went ahead and regulated that long before it happened. Okay? So Deuteronomy 17, beginning in verse 14. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose, one from among your brothers, that is, and you shall set him as king over you. You must not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Now, obviously, we can understand the logical sense behind that. It's why most nations, even to this day, have laws in place that say, unless you're a citizen of that particular nation, especially even from the time you were born, you cannot serve in the highest office and rule in the highest office. Okay? And it has to do with what if those two nations go to war, and a lot of different things involved in it, but that's one of them. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Now, verse 18, when he sits on the throne of the kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of the law approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all his words and of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So, his first job as king, as he takes over, is to sit down and write a copy of the law. Now, there is debate. Some people think that this would have involved writing the entire Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Most likely it probably means just Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy was kind of a summation of everything. But you remember that there's so many things here, you kind of peel back the layers on it. So, first of all, it has to do with what we've talked about before, that owning books is a pretty new phenomenon in the history of the world, right? The ability to mass produce, certainly mass produce that are exactly the same, copies that are exactly the same, that never really happened before, because you had to deal with scribes, and you would always have scribal mistakes somewhere. I mean, who isn't going to forget a comma when they're writing 200,000 words somewhere, right? And so what he's supposed to do is write the copy of the law so that he has it in his handwriting, and so that he can study it on a daily basis. The other people, they were restricted to, even at this time, you don't have synagogue worship. Synagogues don't develop until Babylonian captivity, okay, until after this time. And so they would have to learn it from their local priests and Levites that lived in their communities in those 48 cities that God had deeded to them when they came into the land. And so he has a peculiar privilege to own that copy of Scripture. Now, the second thing is this. If you really want to make yourself understand something, copy it down. I don't mean with a computer, I mean with your hand on a piece of paper. Because it forces you to slow down. You have to be sure that you're actually getting the right word, making sure the endings are correct, making sure the punctuation is correct, which is, by the way, sometimes the only time we pay attention to punctuation, which can change the meaning of an entire sentence. And so forcing the king to, in painstaking detail, write with his own hand a copy, he's going to become very familiar with the law. This is why the scribes in the New Testament were considered experts in the law. Why? Because they spent every single day in detail, in painstaking detail, copying the law. And they had their systems of copying the law. They knew exactly, they had it broken up into a grid, and they knew exactly how many letters were supposed to be here, how many punctuation marks were supposed to be here, and they had to count them up. And by the way, when they made some mistakes, if they caught their mistake, you tore the paper up and you started all over again. When you spend that much time with every single letter and comma and period and question mark in the Old Testament law, you're going to get familiar with it. And that's why scribes in the New Testament are held up, especially in the eyes of the people, and that's why they're antagonistic to Jesus, because they think they understand the law perfectly because they transcribe it. And certainly they did understand it well. But that was the king's job. Now, he said he was to do it under the supervision of the Levites. So go back then to Joash and listen to these words again when he is anointed king. Verse 12, then he brought out the king's son and put the crown on him, he that is Jehoiada the priest. And he gave him the testimony. He handed him the book. It would appear that Joash did not make his personal copy at this age because he's 7. Okay? He's 7 years old. But I have no doubt that at some point he probably did. But he had this personal copy to familiarize himself with it. And furthermore, it's religious, but it's also, in a sense, political. These are the laws by which he is to govern the land that God has given him. It'd be like a legislator having no idea what the Constitution is. Right? That's basically what he's handing him. It has now, with this particular occasion, because it is so special that God had chosen a specific nation at that particular time. He has not done that today, but he did then. It not only served for his spiritual nourishment, but also how he was to run the nation. And so he's setting him up on this particular throne and this anointing. Now, verse 13, when Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she went into the house of the Lord to the people. And when she looked, there was a king standing by the pillar according to the custom, and the captains and the trumpeters beside the king, and the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, treason, treason. Ironic, isn't it? Why? She's the one who committed treason. Isn't it amazing how some people can cause a problem or make a monumentally bad decision and still that somehow, when they have mistreated someone else with their decision, they can still be the victim even though this is the decision that they made? That's what she's looking at. It's treason. No, you need to look back in the mirror. You're the one that's committed treason. Then in verse 15, Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains who were set over the army, bring her out between the ranks and put to death with the sword anyone who follows her. For the priest said, let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord. So they laid hands on her, and when she went through the horses, entrance to the king's house, and there she was put to death. I just find it a little bit ironic. You know, I don't know when we mentioned, I don't know when I say what, let's be honest. But I know we've talked about it before. That sometimes the biblical writers do things, it's very clear when you read it in the original languages. Sometimes in English it doesn't carry over. Hebrew writers who spoke or wrote in Hebrew, like the Old Testament, they very much used puns all the time. Like cracked little jokes, little things that kind of insinuated certain things. And so sometimes when we're studying something, the biblical writer is, in the words of one of my professors who would always say, it's kind of like he's winking at you, saying, get it? I know when I brought it up, Exodus 9, or Luke 9, we were talking about the Lord's Supper. When the word for Jesus' death is exodon instead of thanatos. It's like the writer's winking at you. Here, I mean, part of me has to wonder, we took her out through the horse's gate. Get it? Because that's where she belonged. Now, I'm not saying they didn't take her out through the horse's gate. But I'm also not saying that they didn't. How have you never known politics to not take jest at one another? So they take her out and they execute her for her treason. Then, verse 17, Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, and also between the king and the people. Okay, so the first thing is he made a covenant. Now, we've talked about this before, but when we read in the Old Testament especially, they made a covenant, it's most likely, literally should read, they cut a covenant. Right? You remember we talked about the custom of splitting the animal and the participants in the covenant walking through it. And so the better idea here is not that he necessarily just made a covenant, but that he cut a covenant. Okay, that he split the animal and they walked through. And basically, it was a way of saying, if we don't keep our part of the covenant, may we end up as this animal has. And so they make a covenant between the Lord, the king, and the people. They're rededicating themselves to God. And then he makes a covenant between the king and the people, their willingness to follow him. You see something similar in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when you remember David takes over, and for 7.5 years, he reigns for 40 years, but for 7.5 of those years he reigns in Hebron, and then the rest of them in Jerusalem. And for a small period of time, he reigns over only a small part of the kingdom of Israel. Okay, this is the early parts of 2 Samuel. And Saul's son Ishbosheth is the one who retains control of a great deal of Israel, and then he is assassinated in that. All the people come to David saying, we want you to lead us, and they enter into a covenant there to basically become his people and to follow him. And so something similar here is going on, where they're pledging themselves to one another. The king is promising to care for the people are promising to follow the king. Verse 18, then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. The house of Baal was about 2 miles south of Jerusalem. Now at this point, Baal worship is done. Okay? We've already seen it, as we said in chapter 10. It's been eradicated, but it is certainly done now. Okay? And so they tear it down, his altars, his images in broken pieces, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Mattan is a name that it's kind of hard to tell what this man's ethnicity is, or his nationality, I should say. Because this name is certainly Phoenician, that is Tyre-Sidon in that particular region, which is where Athaliah's family, or their ancestors, are from. That's where Baal worship really started. But it's also used to describe another Jewish man in the Old Testament. So it's kind of hard to tell if this was just like she went and transplanted a priest from Phoenicia and brought him down here to lead in Baal worship, or if this was an Israelite who had gone over and decided to be a priest for Baal. Either way, he's certainly executed at this point, the same way that they were under Jehu and Elijah. Then it says at the latter part of 18, and a priest posted watchmen over the house of the Lord. They began to think after the house of the Lord, and the temple will become a very central building, a very central focus through the rest of 2 Kings from this point forward. It's been neglected, but now it's going to become central. And even so much, really. So we're studying these books under the rise and the ruin of Israel. And you hit the peak of your rise in 1 Kings 11 with Solomon, and then from 1 Kings 11 down, we're just picking up speed as we go down that hill, as we're going to ruin. And part of that zenith was the Temple of Solomon. I mean, you have 1 Kings 6 and 7 and 8 dedicated to it. That was kind of one of those moments where we're at the top. We're who God wants us to be. We've risen. And now that temple is going to take center stage again, and slowly but surely we're going to see it get depleted and depleted and depleted and depleted, and then it's destroyed. When the people are ruined, the house of God is also ruined in the process. And so when we're studying these books, sometimes we have to remember that the writer is driving at a point. Okay? And many times it's small statements that we might consider to be insignificant that are really big shifts in the narrative of how he's telling the story and the point that he's driving home. And this is certainly one of those. Another one we saw last week, or a couple of weeks ago in chapter 10 and verse 32, when part of the land of Israel started being given to Hazael, slowly chipping away. And so Israel is slowly losing control of all of God that God has given them. Verse 19, and he took the captains and the Kerites and the guards and all the people of the land, and they brought them to the king down to the house of the Lord, marching through the gate of the guards to the king's house, and he took his seat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet after Athaliah had been put to death with the sword at the king's house. Now it says the city was quiet. This particular phrase is somewhat peculiar in the Old Testament. It's used the majority of the time in Judges. Okay? And it's always used in connection. So in the Judges, you have this cycle where they sin into idolatry, and then they are oppressed by a particular nation or region, and then they cry out to God in penitence, and God sends them a deliverer, and then they go right back around and do the same thing. Okay, so when God sends them the deliverer in Judges, many times at the end of that judge's work or his deliverance from captivity, the text will say, and the land had rest. And so what that may indicate to us here with it saying the land had rest now that Athaliah has been removed is that Athaliah's reign was one of absolute terror. Right? The people were not happy about it. They were not pleased. She certainly mistreated them. I mean, her father was Ahab and her mother was Jezebel. And we've already seen what they do to people who get in their way. And so it seems that this is something that is welcomed in Judah. And even though Judah is also on this downward trend, in Judah there are at least bright spots. In Israel there aren't any bright spots. Here you at least have some. So in 21 it says Jehoash, which is just another name. Many times they will have multiple spellings and multiple names for kings. He was 7 years old when he began to reign. Now obviously that's going to be an administered reign. He's not making every decision at 7. But you also have to remember that the way they trained royalty, they trained them from an early age, because when you're royal and you're in the line of succession, you're going to have to do certain things. And so their education was pretty suited to what they were going to do. To kind of put that in perspective, Queen Elizabeth, who of course is currently the Queen of England, but she was not, her family, her dad and they were not in line to inherit the throne, right? The prince before them, the king's brother, Queen Elizabeth's uncle, was king, and he stepped down to marry an American actress. And then the king took over. Her dad took over and became king. And then she became queen because of his issues with lung cancer. Now, when she took over, she had to hire private tutors because the only thing she had ever been taught in school was how to organize events and throw dinner parties. She didn't learn international politics. She didn't learn about the things that are involved in running an empire. Why? Because she was never supposed to step into that position. So they didn't train her that way. So when you get into some of those royal circles, you're trained to the degree of the position you're going to inherit. And so even though he's young, he certainly has been being taught and groomed even in the privacy of the temple for this particular job. But of course, Jehoiada is going to be the man who really molds him and influences him and really kind of is ruling instead. All right, chapter 12, let's just keep rolling through this. In the 7th year of Jehu, okay, so Jehu that we read about in chapters 9 and 10, he's still on the throne. Well, that's the bell, so we'll stop there. I think somebody did that on purpose, but anyway. We will stop there and we will look at chapter 12. And I want you to really, for our next class, I want you to read 2 Kings 12 and also read 2 Chronicles 24 and really think upon this premise, because this was Joash's problem. At least from what I can see, the evidence of 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings. Joash's problem was his faith never became his own. And so when Jehoiada dies, Joash just the wheels come off. He makes monumentally bad decisions. He is easily influenced. And part of that has to do with the fact that he became king so young, and while the man who was over him was a godly man, he made good choices. But because he had been so used to having him lead him, that is Jehoiada leading Joash, it made him susceptible because he learned to let other people think for him. And so then when a new set of younger advisors comes in, he's going to do what he's always done. He's going to listen to other people instead of thinking for himself and instead of establishing his faith in what he knew. And so I think there are a lot of things there for us to really contemplate, and hopefully we'll be able to do that next time.